She look cute, this shit.
The accessories include 3 different sets of ear tips, and all 3 have a surprisingly large impact on the sound. I'll talk more about that later. First, let's look at the 142's frequency response. From 20 to 50 Hz, it sits above the preference bounds, which boosts the sub-bass presence. Things like kick drum extension and sub-bass rumble become more pronounced. Then from 1000 to 2000, it clearly elevated compared to GM1, though technically it still stays within the preference bounds. This slightly brings vocal forward and enlarge vocal image a bit. If you look closely around 4000 to 6000, there's also a small peak there. Again, it stays within the range, but in theory, this region enhances certain treble details, things like snare impacts, instrument edge definition, and of course, some added sibilance, though the effect isn't particularly extreme. And then finally, there's the usual 10,000 to 16,000 ear region boost. Next up is the 242. Just like the 142, the 1000 to 2000 region is elevated above GM1, though this time it's pushed slightly further. And the effect is basically the same. Vocals sound closer and vocal image become larger. And the interesting part is the main gain region on 242. Similar to the Fortune from the previous review, the 3000 region is almost completely flat. And finally, just like the 142, there's still an 11 to 14,000 ear region boost, though the gain here is slightly lower than on the 142. On the impedance curve, the impedance at 1000 Hz is 14.83 ohm, and one thing worth mentioning is that DUNU officially lists it as 35 ohm. That's because they are measuring DC resistance at low voltage, while what I'm measuring here is the AC impedance, so the number naturally ends up being different. The highest impedance is 24.45 ohm at 20 Hz, and the lowest is 5.9 ohm. What this impedance curve basically means is if you pair it with a source that has a high output impedance, the higher the frequency, the less power it receives. So subjectively, you'll hear more bass and darker treble if you pair it with a high output impedance source. The 142 has a very similar impedance behavior to the 242. Impedance at 1000 Hz is 13.8 ohm, highest impedance is 33.6 ohm, lowest impedance is 5 ohm. So overall, my recommendation would be to use it with a low output impedance source, unless you really dislike the treble and specifically want the sound to be as dark and smooth as possible. First, let's talk about the 242. The overall tuning still follows that classic DUNU style conservative approach. Very safe, nothing overly aggressive, but also not particularly explosive or dynamic either. So when listening to really intense tracks, like some of the rock song, or take the example of the boss battle soundtrack from Runs X, you might feel like it lacks a bit of aggression and excitement. I'll get into why that happened later in the treble session. But of course, the upside of this kind of tuning is that it becomes very easy to listen for long periods. Same idea as the SA6 EST. Started with the bass, quantity is fairly generous. It's thick, full, and it really fills the lower parts of the stage, creating this warm and slightly diffused feeling. Impact is tuned very nicely, so even though the bass takes a noticeable portion of the presentation, it never feels overly intrusive. Extension is fairly average, but the sub-bass texture is actually quite good. Vocals lean warm, with moderately sized imaging and a slightly forward presentation. There's this soft, rounded sense of body to them, kind of similar to the vocal allure. It's more gentle and emotional style. On top of that, there's this soft sense of envelopment. The tuning focuses more on creating an overall smooth presentation rather than emphasizing things like articulation and mouth texture or breath detail. And of course, one nice side effect of this kind of rounded off presentation is that there's basically no sibilance. Treble brightness is moderate, but extension doesn't go particularly far. Similar to the issue I mentioned with the Rockets, the upper treble here feels a bit too restraint, if you ask my honest opinion. So sometimes there's this sense of the sound not fully opening up, almost like vocal reach higher notes but never quite break through. And this also affects instrument. Going back to Run's Boss Battle original soundtrack as example, the electric guitar loses a noticeable amount of its metallic edge and cutting energy. Those riffs at the beginning and middle of the track, which are normally very aggressive and driving, feels toned down here, because the roughness and bite in the upper treble of the distorted guitar are smoothed over too much. So the excitement factor gets reduced as well. And honestly, this restrained treble extension is also the main reason why the overall dynamics don't feel particularly explosive. That said, this can actually be improved quite a bit with the tip rolling, which I'll talk about later in the ear tip section. The soundstage and technical performance overall feels pretty in line with the average for this price range. Then let's talk about 142. At first, I honestly thought the 142 was basically a cut down version of the 242. After all, the 242 uses a setup with 2DD, 4BA and 2 microplanars, while the 142 simply removes one of the dynamic drivers. But interestingly, the biggest difference in actual listening ended up being in the treble instead of the bass, which honestly doesn't feel very intuitive at first. Later on, one of the DUNU staff explained it a bit, and according to them, the difference between 242 and 142 are basically this. Which means that in practice, the 242 and 142 actually use different crossover system, crossover tuning, and even different mid and high drivers. Getting back to the listening impression, the 142 and 242 are actually very similar in terms of density, note thickness, and overall tonal foundation. But there are three major differences. First, the treble is noticeably darker on 142. Honestly, dark is probably the most direct way to describe it. And because of that, vocal also sound even darker, lower in pitch perception. I think Warmpoos is the best term to describe it. It's kinda an upgraded version of Choose Your Pure, to be honest. Second, the horizontal stage is noticeably narrower than the 242. That said, the 142 isn't strictly a downgrade either. Its bass extension and rebounds are actually a bit better than the 242. The low end feels slightly more bouncy and springy overall. Now let's talk about the ear tips. With DUNU stock drum tips, the biggest characteristic is how relaxed and spacious everything feels. The soundstage is the largest out of the three, and the overall presentation feels the most open and loose. There's this kind of soft comfort to the sound. The frequency balance is also the most even here. Overall, probably the most balanced tuning of the three tips. That said, the downside is that the image isn't very focused. Things can feel slightly diffuse and spread out. The candy tip have one slightly annoying issue. The nozzle opening is pretty small, so getting them onto the IM is kind of a pain. Sound-wise though, they are much more focused than the wrong tip. Image tightens out immediately. The overall balance becomes something like the 442 for bass, mids, and treble, so it leans more towards the lower mids and bass. Honestly, I personally like this tuning quite a lot. The notes feel much more solid and cohesive, but the downside is that treble gets noticeably reduced, so the overall presentation becomes fairly dark. Considering the narrower bore and the fact that the tip opening is actually smaller than the IEM nozzle itself, that result honestly makes sense. The SS tips. This increased vocal brightness a bit and also improved the sub-bass extension slightly, so they don't sound nearly as dark closed in as the candy tips. Overall, I'd say they are probably the best option among the stock tips. After that, I also tried a few aftermarket tips to see if I can improve the 242's restrained treble extension. And overall, I think the best direction is to use a wide bore and treble enhancing tip. Things like the Tri-Clarion FX10 or the W1. The W1 pushes both ends a bit more. Treble immediately sounds less muffled, and bass impact also becomes slightly stronger. It actually pairs quite well with the 242 in my opinion. The Tri-Clarion also helps reduce the closing feeling, but the improvement isn't as dramatic as the W1. There's still a slightly sense of dullness left. On top of that, it introduced this slightly grainy texture to vocals, somewhere between added texture and mild sibilance. The FX10 gives the biggest improvement in the openers. Vocal become noticeably clearer and brighter. The treble boost is even stronger than the W1, but the trade-off is that it also introduces a slight sense of grain. So between the FX10 and W1, it really just comes down to preference tastes.
in between the world of sleep and awake. Seems so far away from where I've been, and unsure but not afraid to try. Roaming in between the world of sleep and awake. Seems so far away from where I've been, and unsure but